Good afternoon, everybody.
Yeah, see how Chicago audiences, they respond.
I love
Good
that.
training.
Even in the snow.
In the snow, well, my welcome to you is welcome to Chicago in April, right?
Ooh.
Welcome to Chicago springtime. It's actually stopped, so.
That makes me feel better.
Yeah. So thank you for being here.
I'm excited to be. I'm excited to be here with you.
Well, I'm a fan of your work, your scholarship, your principled political voice. You were the reason I watched CNN for many years. So we appreciate this opportunity for you to be here. We appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about your work on many different levels, and also this moment, this climate that we're in, and your insights about it.
Of course.
Yeah. So, let's start with the media. This session is about media and democracy. And I think there's so many lessons to be learned from the CNN experience that you had, which of course was speaking out around the issue of Palestinian human rights, eloquent speech at the United Nations, after which you were summarily
Dismissed, yeah.
fired. So, dismissed, that sounds better. So what was your takeaway from that experience as we think of this theme of power? You had a powerful platform.
Yeah.
CNN has a powerful role in shaping discourse, but how does that work? What's the takeaway from that?
It was a complicated, I still struggle with it. I mean, I have no doubt that I have no concern about the speech that I gave. I think I made the right argument at the right time in the right place.
I was persuaded.
Thank you. Unfortunately, CNN had different sensibilities about this sort of thing. I was asked to be the representative of civil society at the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian People at the UN. I was actually in Palestine, and I returned that morning to give this UN speech. And after I gave it, I didn't imagine the kind of response that I got. I wrote a book with Mumia Abu-Jamal. I've been part of prison abolitionist movement. I mean, I've taken positions that are not mainstream TV pundit positions before. So this didn't seem to be, like, of all the stuff I've said and done, this didn't seem to be the one, So the letters and the emails that I got, and the tweets mostly, that I got immediately after the speech, I wasn't surprised by, but that next day when CNN called and said that the speech that you gave was not in line with our values. That's the only thing they said to me. It was about less than a 1-minute conversation. Your speech was not, and I said, well, what specifically about the speech? They said, well, all of it. It was the most bizarre conversation I've ever had. And they said, so unfortunately, you can't be on our air anymore as a CNN commentator. We can't have you on air as a CNN commentator. They made it sound as if it was just this position that they regretted, but because of this awful thing I'd done, they just had no choice but to let me go. And after that, I was shocked. I mean, there were a couple of responses. One was an incredible amount of love and solidarity from people around the world, the political people on the left, Palestinians around the world. There was just a lot of love and support for the position. There were also black people, to the point about power, who said to me, you had a platform where you were able to advocate for black people in a very unique way and from a very particular political posture that isn't easily replaceable. And so you squandered that position. You compromised the media position platform you had and the power you had from there to die on this hill. Was this the right hill to die on? Which was something I honestly hadn't thought about before in that way. I thought about it, but not in that way. And so I learned, that was a thing I hadn't considered, but also I really appreciated how powerful and how I want to use very careful language because of how these things get taken up. There's a lobby for the NRA, there's a lobby for gun rights, there's a lobby for lots of things, there's certainly an Israel lobby. And the level of commitment and organization that I saw in those 24 hours from different organizations to demand my firing, not just from CNN, but from Temple University, was something.
That didn't work.
No, that didn't work, but I won by a hair. And was shocking to me, and it revealed sort of how things can work in certain political discourses.
We've seen the current situation with Congresswoman Ilhan Omar of having words about the Palestinian situation, about Israeli-Palestinian situation, taken out of context, the allegation of anti-Semitism, which, basically putting words in her mouth and her saying, no, I didn't say that, I didn't mean that. The situation with Angela Davis having an award withdrawn at Birmingham Civil Rights Institute and then having it reinstated for speaking out around Palestine. Why do you think, why is Palestine that push-button issue? And maybe you've started to answer the question, but why is it the push-button issue, and why is it the issue that you felt it was important to take a principled stand on?
Yeah. So I'll answer the second part first. Because I think there's, for me, it wasn't about standing in solidarity with Palestine exclusively. It's about being part of a movement that can't divide or separate these various forms of oppression, and that can't make a decision about vulnerable people in Ferguson and not make the same decision about vulnerable people in the West Bank or in Gaza or inside of 48. And so for me, it's also about being part of a Black radical tradition that has taken that seriously. And I appreciate what you said about my work, but I mean, your work gets at this much more deeply, and I'm deeply appreciative for your work. And even in your most recent book, when you lay out the kind of tradition out of which prison abolition movements come, and and these pushes against state violence, it's the Angela Davises, it's the Ruth Gilmores. All this stuff matters, and informs my analysis. With regard to Palestine in particular, it's the Huey Newtons, it's the SNCCs, it's the Malcolm X's, it's the Ethel Miners, to be very specific with regard to SNCC, because those voices often get erased, the black women's voices around this issue. She wrote the SNCC newsletter challenging the response to the Six-Day War. It's the Angela Davises. And so that tradition saw it as necessary to link the forces of oppression. It's not just to say you're oppressed, I'm oppressed, let's work together. It's to say that there's a structural analysis that reveals the interconnection between our suffering and our misery. They're not all the same. Our experiences aren't the same. The way we catch hell is different, but there's some structural forces that don't stop at nation-state borders. And so I was just operating out of that tradition. And as someone who, has traveled to Palestine and now does research there, it was impossible for me to witness what I see on the ground and not respond. And there's been a movement that I think has gained only strength in the aftermath of Ferguson. It's not a new movement, but it's a kind of a renewal of energy toward this question. And I think part of why you see the response to Ilhan Omar and why you see the response to me and the response to Angela is because it's working. It's an effective movement.
Yeah, and one component of that I just want to put out there, which I know you know all too well, is I have also really appreciated the progressive Jewish voices from Rebecca Vilkomerson in her leadership of Jewish Voice for Peace, the young people in If Not Now who just take to the streets and say, these policies don't represent my version of what it means to be Jewish, right? So that's why it's particularly problematic and difficult to swallow when, that kind of solidarity and that kind of critique gets labeled as anti-Semitic.
Right, and that's always been a kind of animating kind of politics for the Zionist movement is to frame Zionism as Jewishness, and therefore any critique of Zionism or any critique of Israeli state practice, through that logic, it becomes an act of anti-Semitism. There has to be room to be able to critique Netanyahu, or to be able to critique the Israeli state as such, even, and to be able to have a dialogue and engagement. We have to keep track of anti-Semitism. We have to be mindful of the fact that there are anti-Semitic forces and anti-Semitic narratives and discourses and tropes in the political discourse. We have to be honest about that and keep track of it and reject it at all times. At the same time that we're doing that, we can't allow any critique of Israel to become a critique of anti-Semitism. We can't allow something like, for example, BDS, a nonviolent call that emerges out of Palestinian civil society to be seen as an anti-Semitic movement. We have to have room for those kinds of conversations. And so people like Rebecca Vilkomerson are amazing. And the fact that JVP has even been so much more progressive in recent years, being explicit about the question of Zionism, being explicit about the question of settlement expansion in even more intense ways than before, I think is a sign of our progress. I mean, but you're on the ground and you're very connected to these activist movements. I mean, are you seeing that energy increasing?
See, this is him flipping this. I said, I'm interviewing
I told her downstairs,
you.
I can't be sitting here with you and not ask no question.
Absolutely. No, I think, voices like yours, Christian Davis Bailey, who does work on blacks in Palestine, making links between the struggles as well as, as we've said, the Jewish voices. Michelle Alexander's piece in the New York Times I thought was really important. And she has a way of writing the power of a kind of convert to an idea. Like when she wrote The New Jim Crow, she was like, I didn't believe this. This didn't resonate for me. And then I thought about it, and I talked to people, and I researched it, and now I see. And so I think that was the tone of her piece in the New York Times too, which I thought was very important. So I do see a shift, and certainly a shift on the ground in grassroots movements. I mean, the movement for Black Lives, which you wrote about, we'll talk about in a minute, and I wrote about taking a principled position in solidarity with Palestinian human rights, caught them a lot of flack and lost them some funding. Absolutely. But they stuck to it. They stuck to it. I want to, you mentioned the settlements, and I wanted to just, before we move from this question to talking about Nobody, which is, if you haven't read the book, it's just such a fabulous book. And I didn't, it wasn't something I didn't know, but you said it with, you wrote with such eloquence that it's just a powerful teaching tool, organizing tool. But anyway.
I was trying to be a fake historian. That's why I say that's my fake historian.
You weren't fake. I mean, sometimes we can be, a little dry, dare I say. But
never.
You certainly were not that. But I want to talk about settlements only in this context because the line in your UN speech that people zeroed in on, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. You were entering into this debate about one state versus two state solution, which our colleague here, not at UIC but in Chicago, Ali Abu Nima, wrote about many years ago in his book One Country. Yep. It has been at the center of a lot of debates, and there's a reason for that, based on how the pattern of settlements has happened, how the shrinking land that was taken in '67 has shrunk, right? And so the viability of two states is kind of what the call for one state comes out of. Can you just speak to that? And I heard you give a pizza example of that.
Oh, yeah.
So just to break it down so that people know, like, what is the issue that was the crux of the matter?
Yeah, and I find great pleasure in the fact that, I wrote that speech, and I don't usually write speeches, so I wrote 22 minutes of stuff on the plane back, and in the subsequent weeks, there hasn't been a hard right-wing critique of the speech or the details. There's been no fact check that's revealed. So I was like, okay, so the primary dispute wasn't about the content, which I thought was critical to say that in 70 years after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is produced, that there's this vast contradiction between what's happening on the ground and what's happening in our kind of political imaginations, some of our political imaginations. And then at the end of the speech, I said, we must do what justice requires, a free Palestine from the river to the sea. And there were people who argue that the idea of river to the sea is itself anti-Semitic because it calls for the destruction of the Jewish state, or it calls for literally pushing Jewish people into the sea. I mean, there were a variety of sort of, in my estimation, sort of strange leaps. One, the phrase, but the primary argument was that river to the sea is a Hamas phrase that is calling for a destruction of Jewish people. One, I would say, while Hamas has used the term river to the sea,
a lot of other people have.
Everybody has used. I mean, it would be like saying the new Black Panther Party said Black Power, and therefore anyone who says Black Power subscribes to the very same politics as the new Black Panther. I mean, Yair, his name Yair Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu's son.
Yeah.
He tweeted, "We should have a Jewish state from the river to the sea."
I saw that recently.
5 days ago. I had to retweet. I was a little petty. I retweeted it. We outraged or not? You know what I mean? Because I'm like, but the Likud party, Netanyahu's party.
Did he get fired from something?
I don't think so. He might have got promoted. The Likud party, their platform statement 74 was from the river to the sea, which includes the West Bank and Gaza. So by that argument, they'd be calling for the destruction and genocide of Palestinian people, which I think is actually a much more persuasive argument, because I think in some ways Yair Netanyahu was calling for that. He's saying send them out to Jordan. So I say that to say that no particular political party has an exclusive ownership of, or even practical use of that phrase. It's a very commonly used phrase from the Labour Party to the Likud Party to Joint List Party. Which is on the kind of radical left of the Arab, what they call the Arab Citizens of Israel parties. We call them Palestinian Israelis. So one, there's just no sort of evidence that that's a particularly Hamasian phrase. But beside that, the idea of saying that I want historic Palestine to be free from the river to the sea meant for me a couple of things. One, it meant that wherever Palestinians are, I wanted there to be a kind of liberation praxis. And it's different in different areas. In Gaza, what liberation looks like is different than in the West Bank. And the West Bank is going to be a different situation than inside of the state of Israel, which is comprised, 20% of it, which is comprised of Palestinians. They do have voting rights. They do have citizenship rights, but there are discriminatory policies which are very different than the kind of things that are faced by someone in Ramallah or Khalil without citizenship rights. So these are the distinctions I was trying to make. But ultimately, yes, I believe in a one-state solution. So when I say a free Palestine from the river to the sea, I'm calling for a one-state solution, one person, one vote. I don't believe...
for everybody there.
For everybody there. I believe everyone should have a vote. I believe Palestinians should have a vote. I believe Israelis should have a vote. I believe everyone should have a single vote and the same citizenship rights. And people say, well, the two-state solution, unfortunately, has become a kind of shibboleth of liberal politics where anyone running for office right now is going to say they believe in a two-state solution. It's like kissing a baby. It's just what you have to say if you're running for office. And for me, I have ideological and philosophical questions about what it means to have this two-state solution, what it means to have a religious state of any sort, Jewish, Islamic, Christian. I have philosophical questions about that, but there's a much more urgent political question, a practical question around the two-state solution, which you alluded to, and that is settlement expansion has not stopped. And much of the land that has been debated and fought over, if you look at the Peel Agreement of 37, if you get to 47 with the UN partition, if you look at 93 in Oslo, all these different moments in history where we're trying to debate over how to divide land, and when I say we, I mean as a global community, much of that land has been taken up. We see settlement expansion in the West Bank. And that's why I was saying it's like sharing a pizza, and we order pizza and we decide to slice, how are we gonna divide this pizza up? You wanna cut it this way, which toppings do you want? And as we cut in the pizzas, we keep discussing how to divide this pizza.
Somebody's eating.
I keep eating it.
Yeah, so there's less to divide.
Yeah. Now we left the two slices and you're like, all right, now we're gonna split this evenly. And I done had 6 slices. And that's what settlement expansion is leading to. So I'm saying the two-state solution is not workable under the current political conditions, and we're moving in the wrong direction.
Thank you for clarifying that. I mean, in the reductionist way in which the conversation happens sometimes, that kind of laying out of a position
there's no room for it.
Doesn't get an audience, doesn't get an airing. So, you started off talking about how you came to this issue through the Black radical tradition, through sort of Black internationalism,
yes.
and certainly that's how I came to the issue when I went to Palestine in 2011 with a Women of Color feminist delegation and saw a lot of parallels there. We went with Beverly Guy Sheftall, who had grown up in the Jim Crow South and saw the segregation and treatment of Palestinians is very much parallel to what she remembered in that context. So let's talk about the condition of Black people today in the context of a sort of Black radical analysis. I've already praised the book Nobody. I quote it in my book. It's very. So you talk about capitalism, power, disposability, the race and the intimacy between race and class politics, and how we can't separate those in the current situation in this country, and how some people have been rendered nobody, from Mike Brown to Eric Garner to Laquan McDonald in Chicago. Speak to that concept of nobodiness in the context of racial capitalism today.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I look forward to your insight on this as well.
Well, you laid it out, the answer.
I mean, a little bit, but I mean, there's so much more. There are so many more things I wish I would have done. It's funny, and I appreciate your kind words about the book. I always think, you always think about the thing you didn't do. And 4 years, what year is this, 2019? 3 years after the publication of the book, I only think about some of the intersections that I didn't drill down deeply enough, particularly around gender, and and so I'm always thinking about how I could have made that more articulate, that critique. But yeah, I initially went to write a book about Mike Brown. It was one of those quick turnaround things, like, hey, tell the story of Ferguson, drill down on the history of Ferguson and what happened with Mike Brown. I flew to Ferguson, and you could still kind of see the makeshift memorial for Mike. And
during the uprising,
during the uprising, yeah, I was there from almost the day after he was killed until through much of that summer. And then I went back, that November. And one of the things that stuck with me was something that one of the residents said when they talked about him being out on the ground for 4.5 hours. She said, because they didn't have a sheet over him for a large part of that time, and they said they left him out there like he ain't belong to nobody. And it just kept sticking with, what does it mean to not belong to nobody? And this idea of precarity kept coming back to me. And academics often talk about this idea of precarity. And I kept thinking about what it means to be in a political moment where, on the one hand, the state is, as we've seen in other moments, but where the state is completely relieving itself of its duty to its citizens, right? We're going to privatize everything. We're going to marketize everything. The market will be the ultimate court of appeal for everything, whether it's schools, whether it's healthcare, whether it's housing, even the military, right? Even as they expand the state, they're also privatizing it. So all this stuff is happening. And then, of course, these private industries are doing what they do, which is to make money and to be efficient, and so those efficiencies don't do well for the vulnerable. And so long before Mike Brown gets killed by Darren Wilson, I'm trying to think through all the forces and processes that get him there before he doesn't get stopped from Darren Wilson for stealing from the store, which wouldn't be, certainly that's not a capital crime, but he wouldn't even stop. He was stopped for jaywalking. And he stopped for jaywalking precisely because Ferguson made most of his money at that time, and largely now, from debts and fines. 80% of the town had a warrant at that point. That's a stunning number, 80%. And so the police officers become tax collectors, bill collectors essentially, and their job is to keep stopping people like Mike Brown for jaywalking. So the death sequence that begins because of a set of state policies and practices that were all about collecting more money. But if you look at if you disaggregate that data for race, it's black folk that are getting pulled over and stopped for jaywalking. White folk are getting pulled over for jaywalking. White people
poor and working class
too.
black folks in particular.
Exactly.
Poor and working class black folks in particular.
Which is what Ferguson is, right? Which is another thing about Ferguson, which is a kind of representation of the suburbanization of poverty. Because Ferguson's a suburb. Compton's a suburb, right? We have to think about suburbs differently sometimes. So there's a much more complicated way to think about this relationship between geography, race, and class. And in each of these mechanisms in the book, what I'm trying to do is show whether it's the criminal justice system, whether it's the way we police, even down to Flint, which is a different kind of state violence. There's this intersection of race and class that renders black folk the most vulnerable, and it renders the most vulnerable the most disposable, because it's much easier to create structures to contain them and blame them than it is to invest in them and support them. And that's the disposability politics that we're seeing today.
And you map out the really important kind of corollary to that, which certainly we see here in Chicago, is the systemic abandonment. Like Mike Brown's government, and even to say Mike Brown had a government sounds like an oxymoron, but Mike Brown's government abandoned him through the abandonment of urban schools that primarily black and brown children attend, abandonment of services, all kinds of, and what's growing, of course, is the prison industry. And Ruthie Gilmore and others talk eloquently about that. That is the warehousing of disposable bodies in this moment.
That's exactly right. That's the public housing we've invested in, right? Is mass incarceration, not true public housing, not public education, not healthcare. All these things have become things that we see as inefficiencies in the market, and so we don't invest in them. It's easier to throw those people away, and Mike Brown becomes an example of that. Normandy School District was the example of that before he ever walked on Canfield. And we can go back through his life and see this in other ways, and we see it with Eric Garner, we see it with Sandra Bland, we see it with Katherine Johnson in Atlanta, with the SWAT forces. All these things are ways that we're not only becoming more committed to criminalization than ever, but we're also more committed to militarization than ever. Yeah.
And you talk about it in your book, and I write about it a little bit in my book, the people who are targeted, the people who have been pushed into the underground economy and informal economy, who sometimes are in and out of the prison industry. Mike Brown is doing what when he's, he has stolen something. Alton Sterling is selling bootleg CDs out of the back of his car to make extra money. Eric Garner is selling loose cigarettes to help support his 4 kids. So there's a correlation between economic marginality, right, and disposability,
Exactly
and
right.
the very pointed, brutal insertion of state violence in the form of prisons, but also in the form of police violence.
That's exactly right. And we normalize that process through this language of broken windows policing and other things. We're making neighborhoods look better. We're making them safer. We're cleaning them up. And then when you add the kind of violence of gentrification that comes in, which only expedites those processes. At Temple University, now we have police cops up and down the street, so that, white suburban kids can skateboard down Broad Street, whereas before you could buy crack in those same blocks. But what happens is those people who are engaged in practices like selling loosies or selling CDs are seen as disruptive to that. And in the name of cleaning up the neighborhood, which is based on a kind of flawed logic of the relationship between disorder and crime, we end up watching people become more and more, we watch even everyday citizens become more and more invested in the logic of criminalization and policing. We got to get these people off the street. God forbid someone stands on a corner selling loose. I mean, is Alton Sterling really a threat to anybody selling CDs in 2016? I mean, he's not even disrupting the music industry. If you sell a CD, you selling SWV CDs, you know what I mean? What are you selling in 2016? So it becomes almost a pretext.
Wait, people aren't using CDs?
Not quite as much.
Just kidding.
No, so it becomes a pretext for a whole bunch of other stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's such an important point. And people who are not, familiar with this, this theory of broken windows, the idea that graffiti, this was in New York with William Bratton and Giuliani, graffiti and small little quote unquote crimes, you've got to come down hard on people because it's a slippery slope to, a full-scale takeover by, murderers and thieves, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And what's interesting, though, is even Bratton's approach and Giuliani's approach is a misreading of the theory.
You point that out, yeah.
Because part of what they were talking about is, and I don't support this, but part of what they were talking about was a community policing model, not driving through in patrol cars, but walking through the police, knowing the kids, knowing the neighborhood. So when you see a kid hooking in school, you say, yo, come on, you bring her back to their mama house. Somebody has drinking a 40 on the block, you tell them to put it in a brown bag. Part of it was to say that we clean up the neighborhood so that it doesn't have the perception of disorder, which then leads to crime. The idea wasn't to just take everybody and lock them up. Even if you bought into the logic of broken windows policing, it didn't mean to do what we ultimately do now, which is to drive through like an occupying force and simply arrest people for the smallest of crimes.
You mentioned the issue of gender before, and that one of your regrets about your book that you didn't talk as much about it, and I would be remiss with my black feminist credentials if I did not come back to that question, and I want to ask it in this way. One of the things that I found in my interviews with people who had been a part of the protests in Ferguson, and certainly the movements and organizations that have emerged out of them, Black Lives Matter Global Network with Alicia Garza and Patrice Khan Cullors and Opal Tometi, and Black Youth Project 100 with your friend Charlene Carruthers at the helm for the first few years. Those were explicit, and even Dream Defenders in Florida had a very explicit intersectional feminist analysis. BYP says we organize through a black queer feminist lens.
Right.
So we have what sometimes is presented as an attack on black men in the form of police violence, giving rise to a movement led by black feminist women and men, feminist men. I'm just wondering how you see gender politics or black feminist politics in particular, and I am qualifying it in that way, manifest in this generation. I realize you're a little older than I thought, but I had put you in that demographic of millennials, but you just look really young.
I'm 40. So. I'm 40. I'm right at the line. I'm too old for the BYP 100.
Right. You just aged out of BYP.
Yes, I'm very upset about that. You got to be 35 or under. So like when they were on the ground marching, I was just at the cutoff point.
You just put on a T-shirt though, and you can fake
That's
it.
What I'll do. I'll just keep it.
But what do you think about how the gender politics have emerged in the movement?
So it's fascinating, and again, your book is incredibly powerful and compelling about this. And one of the things you talk about in the opening chapter is not just that black women are organizing it, but this is this moment where a black feminist analytic is driving the movement and is not driving it for an end that is explicitly or directly for the purpose of black women. In other words, black women are leading this movement through a feminist analytic for the liberation of everybody, which is like,
That's the idea.
that, I mean, and it shouldn't be earth-shattering, but it kind of is, and it's kind of beautiful, I think, at this moment to see that. So there's the visual sense of the leadership of Black Lives Matter with Opal and Alicia and Patrice, and then with BYP with Charlene and all these wonderful these leadership models that are led by Black women, often Black queer women. That's incredibly powerful. It's a powerful rejoinder to the kind of Black male cisgender, often middle-class preacher who's driving a lot of these movements. And so when we're in Ferguson, and certain of those folk getting booed or other things, it was a refreshing movement. But beyond the kind of optics of it, the idea of asking different questions, of saying that we need different representations, even of what is a suitable or even respectable victim, becomes more complicated. So that we have to fight for CeCe McDonald in Minnesota with the same energy that we fight for Trayvon or Mike Brown. Now, I can't say we've always mastered that. Clearly, we haven't, right? Because it's much harder to get support for Renisha or Marissa, or we're going down the list.
Corinne Gaines. Yeah.
Corinne Gaines is a perfect example. And that summer of 2014, Black trans women were under assault by I mean, they always are, but even in terms of high-profile cases, Black trans women were getting killed through state violence and police-involved violence at an alarming rate. You know, that conversation got moved from the margins closer to the center, and it's at least it's an expressed commitment of ours. Patriarchal and misogynist politics are at least challenged, at least rhetorically at this moment. Again, there's huge gaps between theory and praxis in these movements, but at least it's on the agenda. And so I'm excited about that. In the same way that I'm excited by an internationalist politic, I'm also excited by a feminist politic, by a queer politic. And I think that this next generation is getting it right far more. I came up in a kind of Black nationalist tradition as a teen organizer and activist, and these just weren't things that we would talk about. I mean, they just weren't on the agenda. It was always the kind of, after we finish this revolution thing, then we're gonna work out this gender stuff. And not only is that impractical, it's unethical, and and so we have a different political imagination about what we look like after empire, to borrow what's her name's phrase. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm also heartened by young cis men who also are taking up the mantle of Black feminism. You know, people like Philip Agnew, and you know, you're young also, vis-a-vis me. But that's very hopeful. And I want to also, you know, there are lots of debates about so-called identity politics, right? Which I don't subscribe to identity politics, but I understand, you know, the way in which struggles around race and gender and sexuality have been important ways to bolster struggles that would have, you know, been reduced to sort of class struggle only.
Yeah.
And in the 2016 Vision for Black Lives document that came out of the Movement for Black Lives, this was the most expansive document for a progressive agenda, from immigration rights, reproductive rights, climate change. These were not narrow issues. These were not issues that only applied to one group. These were issues that, and through it all, there was a class analysis that said poor folks, economically marginalized, incarcerated folks, working class folks, bear the brunt of all of this. So, so I just want to kind of put that out there. That expansive vision, that holistic vision, is what makes, an intersectional feminist analysis so powerful and appealing to liberate everybody, not just.
Let me ask you a question. How do you respond to the folk, against the backdrop of that moment, who are saying, there's the ADOS movement, there's some of the Afro-pessimist movements that are, I don't want to say moving backwards. I mean, I would say that, but to voice it in the way they would say it, that there's a particular kind of, on the ADOS side, obviously there's a certain set of economic and political conditions that are faced by descendants of slaves here in America that can be obscured by this kind of internationalist focus, and other folks saying, even as not at the ontological level, like maybe there's something about the conditions of slavery and post-slavery that have to be tended to, and that our expansive focus is losing sight on a very acute problem that has never been adequately addressed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't think those are mutually exclusive.
Oh, I'm sorry, ADOS is a movement that has emerged from some activists. It seems largely digital online, I think. ADOS stands for American Descendants of Slavery, And it's a movement saying it's partially a reparations movement, but it's calling for political attention and organizing attention around the unique conditions of American descendants of slaves.
And the American in that is significant because it's also undermining kind of African diasporic analysis.
Yes.
So people who were victims of the transatlantic slave trade ended up a lot of places. Most ended up initially in Brazil and Latin America, then here and so forth and so on. I mean, I think there's a point to be made. I don't think it's being made in the right way, and certainly not a way consistent with my sort of political vision. And I appreciate our timer just told us to segue to Q&A when you asked this very expanded question. But I'll try to be quick and brief. I think it shrinks the vision, right? I think we can do both. I think we can say, and I'm a historian, right? Every historical moment is unique. Historical context is important. There are very few universal, timeless universals that that matter every time and place, in the world. So I think we can understand the unique experience of enslaved people in this country and still say there are parallels around the world, still acknowledge a diasporic experience, and still build on that tradition of Black internationalism, which has been so powerful and so robust, going back to, really going back to the anti-slavery movement. So anyway, but, phase 2 of this discussion at some other point, we will go into that. And I also wanted to ask you about your newest project, Uncle Bobby's, which is the cafe. I'm gonna ease into the questions while you think about that. But he has a coffee shop and bookstore in Philly that I'm envious of because that's kind of my retirement agenda, which may never be realized. We're
gonna make it happen.
Okay, all right. I'll just sit there and drink coffee and talk about interesting ideas all day. But anyway, you all have been a very patient and gracious audience. No tomatoes thrown at us or anything like that. So we want to turn it to you and invite you to put some questions on the table for the next 15 minutes or so.
Thank you very much, Barbara. So we're going to have mics circulating on either side. Go ahead and raise your hand if you have a question to ask. Why don't we start right over there, Allison? And please do make sure that you speak into the mic so that everyone can hear. Thanks.
Up for climate justice and economic justice and racial equality, we could change the world. So I hope we're all involved in moving our legislators to not just reelect themselves, but to do what we want them to do.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, the shifting electoral arena is interesting. Both the outspoken folks in Congress, here in Chicago, our city council is not going to be yes people
I'm impressed
anymore.
by
We
y'all,
hope.
what y'all doing here.
Well, we'll see what happens. We have to struggle on many fronts though to get that 3 point. What do we need? How many people we need? 3 point. All right, we're working on it.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm a doctoral student at USC, so thank you for your wisdom and knowledge. I'm wondering about talking more about Chicago in particular since you're here, and the fact that we've elected Mayor Lightfoot, and your thoughts on the idea of responsibility politics or identity politics and what that might mean for this moment and this movement right here in Chicago, and how we proceed from that with the larger macro things we're talking about structurally both here in the United States and abroad.
Yeah. I mean, that might be a better question for you. I can say a little bit of, because I don't know as much about the local politics here, but one thing is that I'm energized by is the amount of grassroots organizing and real aggressive, particularly in the runoff, the kind of aggressive challenge to business as usual centrist politics that were needed in order to pull the mayor-elect to the left, even if it's just to get elected. Now the question is accountability. So we can't just celebrate that there's no Rahm Emanuel. We have to say, what are the non-starters? What are the non-negotiables? What are the demands that we have, and how can we keep that pressure of maybe not, of a critical mass of people on them? I think that's what encourages me. Nationally, I don't think we have the same I'm not as optimistic, at least in the presidential elections. When I look at who's front running, when I look at what agenda items are on the table and what constitutes common sense right now, I'm not as optimistic. But locally, I do think that there's that energy there, and I think it comes down to grassroots organizing and really the youth movements that Chicago has just been producing so powerfully.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I mean, I wrote a piece in The Nation about this where, I said, at first I tried to acknowledge that, yes, it is historic that we had 2 black women in a runoff. I mean, this city has a history of racist machine politics, let's just be for real. So the fact that demographic changed was significant. But in the 21st century, in the era of the movement for Black Lives, with all these very savvy young organizers out here, that's not enough. And so immediately in the runoff, they were not kind of like, oh, we're not going to have old school politics, we're going to have a black woman. They were like, what are you going to do? What about Lincoln Yards? What about the gang database? What about gentrification that's pushing out more and more black people every month, from this city? What about the community benefits agreement with the Obama Library? So all of those issues are on the table, and there are new coalitions and formations that are emerging. The R3 coalition that I work with, Resist, Reimagine, Rebuild Chicago. Grassroots Collaborative has filed a lawsuit around Lincoln Yards. The folks who've organized No Cop Academy are still very much in motion, even though the city council voted to allocate that outrageous amount of $95 million, plus whatever the city's going to have to pay back in bonds. So I think the movement is very much in motion and is not satisfied. And, this is one of the things about having an analysis of structural racism as it relates to all kinds of other forms of oppression and exploitation. In Baltimore, when there was the uprising about Freddie Gray, the mayor was black, 3 of the 6 cops were black, but the activists still indicted that as an example of institutional racism. They weren't so quickly fooled by certain kind of cosmetic changes. So I think there's an opportunity here. I think Lori Lightfoot did say some important things in the campaign. I interviewed her, and I said to her, what do you think, what did the movement in the streets do in shaping this election? She said, if people hadn't shut down Michigan Avenue, we wouldn't be having the conversation that we're having now. Now, that was on the other side of the election. Now we're on the you're in power side of the election. Let's see how that understanding is reflected in policy. And people like you and some of the organizers I see sprinkled around the room will be the ones to hold her accountable. Thank you, Dr. Jackson.
A few weeks ago, April 13th, the Congressional Black Caucus sent out a statement, very sort of anemic statement, condemning Trump for essentially inciting violence against Congresswoman Omar. It wasn't a very full-throated statement, but I am wondering what you think it will take to get political institutions, black institutions in general, to be more forceful in their critiques of the state of Israel. Because right now, for a long time, I mean, even during the anti-apartheid struggle, importantly, Ron Dellums still didn't support censoring Israel's selling of arms to South Africa, apartheid South Africa. So there's just a long history of the CBC in general not standing up on this issue. So what do you think could be done in that area?
I mean, I do think the ball is moving. The pendulum is swinging. I think that we're moving in the right direction. CBC is going to be the last group maybe that moves on this issue. I mean, there's a long tradition of particularly black elite being engaged early by Israel lobbies. HBCUs are often given trips to the Holy Land. Black churches are often grabbed in their congregants, and major megachurch pastors now are being taken over to the Middle East. I'm watching a tour right now of prominent black intellectuals being sponsored by similar groups, and so there are a lot of forces operating against it. The CBC this isn't exclusive to the CBC. I think the Democratic Party in general is reluctant to have a full-throated critique of Israel. I mean, you see the most courageous movement move coming out of the Democratic Party, at least the White House, was an abstention at the UN level, right? On settlement expansion. So there's a wide constellation of things moving and happening. But I think the pendulum is swinging. I think after the Gaza war of 2014, when people saw the disproportionate force, when people saw schools and YMCAs being bombed, they saw the number of hospitals and civilian casualties, the public opinion has shifted. I'm working on a book right now called Except for Palestine, which is a critique of American liberalism on this question. And when you look at the polling numbers just in the last 5 years, there's a dramatic shift. Politicians don't have feelings, they have interests. So it's when those interests get shifted and they converge with the interests of the people, I think you'll see it move. The fact that what happened to Angela Davis, I think, let me say a couple quick things. The Iran deal a couple of years ago was the first example where you saw AIPAC fight a big war and lose. AIPAC will often back out if they think they can't win a battle. They went to war on this Iran deal and lost. So we saw, hey, they're beatable. The strength of BDS shows, hey, this is a winnable fight. The fight for human rights is a winnable fight. The response to how Ilhan Omar is being treated, the response to Angela Davis, even more so, I think was an example of like, hey, wait a minute. Maybe the people aren't with us the way we thought they were. And so politicians will begin to swing. The CBC won't make a more full-throated statement, though, until there's political leverage there and until we show the consequences of not taking a humane position on Palestine. I think that day's coming sooner than we think. Look at gay marriage 10 years ago, just to give you one example. I mean, I think there's a way that it takes forever and then it happens like that, and then all the people, or prison abolition or mass incarceration. I mean, there was a moment where we wouldn't be talking about prison abolition in polite spaces like this, you know? And then suddenly things are shifting and the conversation expands, it happens quickly, and the same people who were like never this are now like, I've always been with this. And that's just not politicians, that's academics too. So I ain't gonna name no names, but you just look. So so I'm optimistic.
Good.
We've got a question right back here.
I think the move on, just while that person's formulating their question, you know, the situation with Angela Davis and the Civil Rights Institute in Birmingham was an interesting one, and one that I and other people in this room were involved in sort of protesting and speaking out against the withdrawal of this award to her because she had spoken out on the issue of Palestine. And many people, many African-American political leaders and other figures who had never weighed in on this issue were forced to say, you know what, she's going to be blacklisted? I mean, is this McCarthy? What is this? So I think people shifted that we didn't think, and people found their voice who had been, confused and muted before then. So it's interesting. It's a shifting terrain, I think.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I've been thinking about community.
Can't see who's speaking.
Oh, sorry, I'm sitting here with a baby.
Relax, that's okay.
Thanks. I've been thinking about the white racial frame and community planning efforts and how racist those institutions have been since the beginning of this country. And when we talk and think about Flint or Ferguson, I think they're really community planning failures, and the legacy of dispossession and state-sanctioned violence. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on what reparations might look like in those local contexts.
Boom. And 2020, in the presidential debate, the word reparations has been uttered.
It's happening.
See?
Yeah, see?
You watch enough history and things change.
Things change.
That's what keeps me in business, that things change.
Exactly.
You keep writing about it.
I'm energized by that reparations conversation. I don't know if I buy it yet, but because reparations means a lot of things to a lot of people.
Yeah.
It's like saying I support justice.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but I am energized that at least there's a conversation about repairing structural damage done. In Nobody, I talk about some of the community planning failures in Ferguson. I talk less so in Flint. Flint, I focus more on the kind of political economic structure, but in Ferguson, I definitely talk about, in nerdy almost detail, about some of the things that happen with housing in St. Louis, Pruitt-Igoe, et cetera. That said, I think when I think about what a reparations looks like, I think about a few things. There's obviously a public housing crisis that we have to think about, and finding ways to resist the kind of, not just gentrification, but the ways in which other pieces are being taken from vulnerable folk, right? Rent control, just as one example. These are things that we can reimagine and reshape for people who have been historically dispossessed. Free college, public education not stopping in 12th grade and it being a kind of universal right, I think is another way, particularly for the vulnerable. I would argue that for everybody, but since you're just talking about it in the context of reparations, thinking about it in that way, I think a greater commitment, connection to food and food access and food justice is something, I think at the local level that would, so it's almost like the food, clothing, and shelter kind of thing that we've been saying forever. I see food justice as a real legitimate way, whether it's subsidizing community gardens, whether it's shrinking the kind of food insecurity that emerges with these deserts, but a real structural investment in making sure that people have access to healthy food as well. These are the types of things that I think are actionable relatively quickly and easily. And at the local school level, I think giving people more control over their schools, or more control over who's leading their schools, what curriculum looks like, reimagining the tax funding models so that it doesn't remain common sense that rich people get good schools and poor people get worse schools. These are things that we can do relatively easily. And so these are things that, this is part of how I imagine a kind of reparations project, in addition to, of course, living wages and all the things that I think cut across the board.
We have time for one more question.
For folks who, are not convinced about reparations being a useful conversation and frame, I mean, you think of generations of stolen land and stolen labor, which are really the economic foundations of our society. How can that not have an impact on how generations of formerly enslaved people navigate this environment? So, I mean, if we just go back, I mean, people said slavery was a long time ago. Really, not that long ago. But the theft of indigenous land and the theft of black bodies and black labor as being a sort of crucible that we still have to reckon with, I think is really critical. Sandy Darity, as an economist at Duke, is coming out with a book, We Waiting, that actually calculates what some of the loss and what some of the theft has looked like. I mean, you can put numbers. I mean, you can't put numbers on human lives, but you can put numbers on stolen labor. If people had gotten paid for their labor, like what would they have to pass on, et cetera? Anyway, last question, I think.
And I'm going to struggle with this question in this particular environment, and given your discussion and the questions that have been asked, because I am critical of Israel's official policy toward Palestine and its treatment of Palestinians, but I am not a supporter of BDS. And you made what I consider a positive reference to BDS, which I would appreciate your explaining, because I view a lot of what they have done and said as anti-Semitic. It's against Jews and the state of Israel, as opposed to a policy of treatment.
Could you just say a little bit more about what specifically you find objectionable? Just so I'm not veering too far off the course you're on. I just want to make sure we're having the same.
You made a passing reference to BDS.
Yeah.
As an organization that is in alignment, it seemed, with your viewpoint and what you've expressed. And that is not how I interpret what they have said and done.
I got you. Okay.
So I would like you to talk a bit about why this is an important, why you want to recognize them as doing something for the good.
Yeah, I think we may have different analyses of. So one, I think when we talk about BDS, just for the context of everyone, we're talking about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that emerged out of Palestinian civil society nearly a decade ago as a way of redressing some of the policy and material conditions that are happening in historic Palestine. BDS calls for three things. You would say the destruction of Israel. There's no charter to BDS.
The person who asked the question and I were both at the same legal
Oh, I see. I know what you mean by destruction. So I get what you're saying. Okay. So BDS calls for three things.
I hate to say we're over.
Can we? This feels like
I'm fine to
This feels
stay.
like an overtime moment, though.
Yep, go for it.
Yeah.
It's an important question.
Yeah, it's an important question. I want to give it the respect that it deserves. BDS calls for three things explicitly. BDS was a call out of Palestinian civil society for the boycott, divestment, and sanction of institutions that support or reinforce the occupation. The BDS calls for three things. It calls for full rights for what the State of Israel calls Arab citizens of Israel. Some would argue they already have full rights, but if you go to a site like IDALA or you look at, I could name a few laws, but there are laws that are facially neutral but are discriminatory to Palestinians inside the State of Israel. One example would be the Nekba law. Another example would be admissions committees in neighborhoods that determine whether you can live in a neighborhood based on whether or not you sustain the social and cultural fabric of the neighborhood. There's a long history of neighborhoods doing, or cities doing that in the States and other places. The second call is a call for a return to the pre-1967 borders, the call for the return to the pre-1967 borders. And the third call for BDS is the right of return for everyone who was expelled in 48 and also displaced in 1967. Those are the only three calls. There's no official BDS charter, but those are the three calls. If there's an argument, I hear your question. I think I hear your point. There is an argument that has been made, though, that the right of return would lead to a demographic shift that would lead to a different balance. But there is no. Are you thinking of Hamas?
What charter are you talking about?
I can't remember the name of the charter. There were several lawyers who were at this who had looked at it and had talked about what they had put together, and it's not just a call, it is for the destruction of
Yeah. So if there is it possible that someone?
But it's an. Yeah.
Okay, well, there is no, I can say unequivocally, and Omar Barghouti has a wonderful book that lays out the entire premise of it. There's an international BDS, BDS website. There's lots of information on BDS that demonstrates that that's not part of the call. Now, is it possible there's someone who simultaneously supports BDS and wants that? I can't say, but what I can say is that BDS as a movement is against all forms of discrimination. It's agnostic on the state question. But it's against all forms of discrimination, including homophobia, transphobia, and anti-Semitism. And so the reason I support BDS, just to complete the thought on your question, I know we gotta go, I'm sorry.
It's a very important question. I wish we had had it earlier.
Yeah, me too. But it comes when it comes. Is because I think, one, because it emerges out of Palestinian civil society. It's their call. People say, well, why just Israel? Which is part of why people see it as a non-positive thing. I would support a BDS movement out of Saudi Arabia. I would support one out of Bahrain. I would support one out of Yemen. I would support one in Uganda. There just hasn't been one out of those civil societies, but I do support and very publicly often demand for those things from Saudi Arabia and Yemen, et cetera. People say that it's, people, I guess what I struggle with is it's similar to black folk in the States where like they say, you know, don't use violence, and then you have your hands up and they shoot you, and they say, well, we're dressed well, and they shoot, you know. It's like, this is at the same time that people are decrying Palestinian violence, this is a non-violent call out of civil society to, you know, and it's not other people say it's targeting individuals. It doesn't, it only targets institutions. Although there could be an argument, as in South Africa, to target institutions as well that support the occupation. Again, I can't say that there's never been a BDS member who has ever said something problematic. I would think we could say that in any movement. We certainly could find that in any party, any movement in the world. But I think BDS as a movement and as an organization and its official positions on things, I would, and I'm happy to give you my information and yours as well. If you find that charter, please email it to me. And if there's any information you see that's a statement that comes out of the BDS, a formal statement from the BDS movement, I would love to see it. And if it is problematic or anti-Semitic or any otherwise problematic, I would publicly denounce it and decry the statement as well.
Yeah, I mean, you know, BDS kind of modeled itself on the campaign against apartheid South Africa. And it was a movement, the South African anti-apartheid movement was something very close to my heart. And would the character of Israel change? Would things change in what is now the, you know, boundaries from 48? Probably so, yes, they would. You know, but that, you know, to then use the word destruction, what does destruction mean? Reimagining, expanding, acting, but what does that mean? You mean changing Israel as it currently exists?
She means Judenrein. You mean the actual elimination, destruction of violent destruction. Yeah, and
Chasing Jews into the sea, that all that anti-Semitic stuff. Well, I mean, obviously we don't support that. We don't read BDS that way. I think a lot of sit-down discussions need to happen. I certainly have had a bunch of them. We'll happily have a bunch more. But I think when you say there's a charter, but I don't remember you know, I can't respond to. Send it to me. Send it to me. I forget stuff happened last week, so I'm not criticizing you for that. But I'm saying I've never seen anything like that. I have fought against anti-Semitism my whole life. I have family members who are Jewish, who, you know, ancestors who experienced the Holocaust. I mean, this is not anti-Semitic movement. It's a movement for human rights. It is a nonviolent movement, and I think we really have to dig into the weeds and the details of it to deal with it on its own terms and not to place on it words and assumptions that the proponents have not articulated. So anyway, it's a very important question at the end of a very important discussion, and I'm certainly, both of us are happy to continue in other venues. Thank you all for being a great audience.
thank you.